Hello, dear students. So as we look at chapters 14 and 15 of the Ethics of Abortion this week, as we're looking into these arguments from Callahan and Wolf, I think it would be helpful as we try to evaluate any particular claims that are being made, some of which we might not have expected, as we look at the particular sort of smaller arguments inside each chapter. It can really be helpful to place those in the arguments of the chapter as a whole. And also to notice that, like a lot of what we've been reading this semester, there's a sort of conversation going on, right? You can think of there as being a kind of dialectic where these two chapters are in a conversation together. And in the case of these chapters from Callahan and Wolf, I think that there's more that's the same in these arguments than is different, right? So when you get to the very end at the conclusion, that's a big difference, right? One person says abortion is wrong and we should have a pro-life position. And the other argument says abortion is kind of wrong, but we should have a pro-choice position. So there's a difference in the sense of pro-life position versus a pro-choice position, but most of the argument along the way is not in disagreement, right? So most of what these two people are saying is something that they share in common. And so what they're both doing is arguing from a feminist perspective, from feminist ideals that they think a lot of people hold in common, to a revision of the feminist position, you know, put the in scare quotes if you want, right? That there's a sort of mainstream idea of what a default feminist position on abortion should be. That in fact there is a kind of default position that people who claim to be feminists actually take on abortion, and that there needs to be a major revision of that. So I want to look a little bit at the structure of these arguments. For Callahan, you'll notice that she's got these really helpful headings all through the chapter, right? And they all say like from something to something, right? So she's signaling the exact kinds of shifts in thinking that she thinks needs to occur. So she says, look, there's this kind of feminist vision, and the problem is just that the feminists aren't feminist enough. That's what she's saying, that they need to expand and refocus the vision for what feminism is. And she thinks there's been this kind of unreflective pro-choice commitment that it just sort of somehow, excuse me, at some point it was just decided that the default feminist position is pro-abortion, and she thinks that's actually in conflict with the values of feminism. And one of the first specific arguments she gives, and it gives the kind of structure for the rest of the arguments in the chapter, is that you have this really individualistic sort of conception of how moral rights work, and that really individualistic conception is wrong, and that if we changed to a more, what she calls an inclusive ideal of justice, then we would also move away from this affirmation of abortion as some sort of good thing. So she notes specifically that there's this kind of property rights view of justice, right? And this is Thompson's whole argument, is that a person has a right to the use of their own body. She talks about that in terms of property rights, right? Her analogies are things like, well, you don't have to let people into your house if you don't want to, right? That's a property right thing. Use of something, that's a property right thing. And she thinks that kind of view of justice as being about let's make sure we respect everyone's property rights is an oppressive view of what justice is. And I think we can see this. She says a couple things about it in the chapter. We can add to it, I think, some of the things that Gruen said in her chapter. So Gruen had noted that historically there's been this sort of division where the rational is associated with the masculine and the emotional is associated with the feminine. And of course, Gordon goes on to criticize that distinction. But if someone accepts this, and this, it seems to me, is still a very common thing, right? I still hear people say this all the time, right? Men are rational and women are emotional. If you accept this kind of characterization of things, and if you associate the criteria for moral rights with rationality, so there's a bit of the AMC kind of hiding in the background here. If you then associate possessing moral rights with rationality, then there's a pretty clear inference to those who are non-rational or less rational not having moral rights. And Callahan thinks that this kind of thinking has been used to deny rights to women historically, that it's been used to deny rights to racial minorities, to people whose sexuality or gender identity does not fit the mainstream, to religious minorities, that it's a kind of way of thinking about how moral rights work that generally functions to give moral rights to very few people and to oppress an awful lot of other people. And so she thinks, well, of course, we're sort of undermining our own ideals here if we are using this view of justice that is so readily oppressive. And in this case, the oppressed would be the fetus. So throughout, she's got this turn, right? It's always from to, so from essentially some kind of individualistic type conception of how moral rights work to a more interpersonal understanding of relations and obligations. And we've seen these kinds of criticisms show up in a lot of our authors before. Callahan's using that kind of way of thinking. Well, we need to shift from individual rights to some other way of thinking about how morality works. And in this case, she thinks there's sort of questions that we can ask, and that those questions are really telling. Right? Do I start by asking about, well, what about my rights? Or do I start by asking about, well, what are my obligations to others because of the relationships that I have to them, because of my sort of context within society, recognizing that I am always with others. If I do that, then I might not think so much about what my rights are, but more about like, what do we do for each other? So it's just a different way of thinking about how to do moral reasoning. And if Callahan's right, then there needs to be this sort of shift. And she thinks that the shifts in ideals will also press a shift in the very practical question of whether abortion is morally permissible or not. So she has a suggestion, right? So there's we've seen this in a lot of our authors as well. There's a sort of negative argument to begin with. Here's what's wrong with the way these other people have said these things. Here's what's wrong with the way that we've done things. And you can just have a negative argument. But she says, oh no, I've got a positive argument too. So, right, so if we want to get rid of that way of thinking, here is the replacement that is suggested. So she says pro-choice feminism lacks moral vision. She thinks that essentially feminism got sort of co-opted along the way, and it became less about finding full equality for women in the sense of an expanded idea of what equality means, and it became about getting equality for women in a sense of making women the same as men, right? So not an equality that recognizes differences, but an equality that covers over differences. And so from her perspective, that's what happened, right? That essentially pretty early on, I mean, I guess essentially in the 60s is what she's talking about, women got sold a bill of goods that said, here's the real ideal, right? You should try to be just like men. You want to play this sort of career game, and you want to be able to, in this context, you want to be able to have sex without consequences, she thinks is the lie that was told. And she makes these arguments. She says, what does abortion do? Abortion makes a woman's body more like a man's body, right? Men can have sex and not get pregnant. A lot of women, not all women, can get pregnant as a result of sex. She thinks that's a difference that's important to sort of promote and say is a good thing, and abortion is a way of saying that that's a bad thing. So she says, look, we need to just completely reconceive of what we mean by sexuality. Right, so a big change, not just is abortion permissible or not, but look, we just need to rethink human sexuality entirely. When people say sexuality, what they mean is having sex. And she thinks this is a male-centric conception of what sexuality is. This idea that sex is having fun without consequences. And so her suggestion is we need to feminize sexuality. And she has a lot of very specific things to say about what that involves. And I think some of those things, it's going to make a lot more sense why she's bringing those up if we place it in this context of she thinks that there needs to be a shift in how we think about what sexuality is. This is a big if. If this is a male-centric conception of what sexuality is, then the shift needs to be to feminize sexuality. And she does say expressly that her model depends on a biological distinction between the sexes, that she thinks that we can draw moral conclusions from these biological distinctions, male and female. And I'll just note, I'm typically wary when people say that, because usually the next thing that they say is not at all a justified inference on the basis of whatever biological facts they say that they're talking about. But in this context, that is Callahan's claim, right? That there's sort of biological facts about the differences between male and female, and that those biological facts mean that we have a certain male way of sex and we have a certain female way of sex. And she thinks that society has just completely said the male view of sex and ignored the female view of sex. And so she thinks the correction is to actually change the way we think individually, but sort of as social structures are set up to change those things, to embrace a more feminized view of sexuality. So she notes that this sort of second wave feminism in the 60s rejected that Victorian sexual ethic, which was used to oppress women, but they didn't replace it with a new one, right? They just sort of the free love, no consequences sort of thing that was happening in the 60s. That's the kind of thinking she's using. We got rid of one sort of oppressive sexual ethic, but we didn't replace it with a new, better one. We just kind of didn't have a sexual ethic at all. So her argument is that the way forward for feminism now is to correct that oversight. And she thinks if we accept this sort of feminized view of sexuality that she's suggesting, that that corrected course will be one without abortion. So when we come to Wolf, we're getting a pro-choice argument, but it's a pro-choice argument that says, look, we feminists who are pro-choice are doing a really bad job of being pro-choice feminists. We need to completely change the way we conceptualize this, and in particular, we need to completely change the way that we talk about this. She's linking those two, right? It's rethinking it, but also completely changing the rhetoric of how feminist goals are stated. So even though she is ultimately pro-choice on this, she, like Callahan, is calling for really complete reconceptualizing. Like we just need to completely change the way it has been, and then she's going to suggest some positive way forward for that. I think the context here is really helpful. She mentions Norma McCorvey towards the beginning here, and if you didn't take a moment to look this up, or you missed, there's a point in the text where she mentions this. You might not put two and two together. Norma McCorvey is Roe from Roe v. Wade. So at this time of the writing of this article, by Wolf, McCorvey had been in the news a lot. So she had, at some point after Roe v. Wade, became a self-professed born-again Christian. And she had said things like, actually, I think that most abortion shouldn't be legal. And so you might understand how this would be considered newsworthy and a big deal, like, oh, Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court case that made abortion legal, and then now the woman who was at the heart of that case is now saying, no, abortion's bad. And so it was in the news. She had a nuanced view, right? She didn't say all abortion was bad, but she definitely didn't say like all abortion is good, which was the immediate outcome of Roe v. Wade, and then it's been kind of dialed back along the way since then. So she had said this, and then people came out of the woodwork to say a lot of very, very mean things about her. There was just a lot of, well, we shouldn't be listening to her. She's stupid. She's been co-opted by religion. She's a drug addict. We can't listen to her. She doesn't understand all these things. Just all this sort of ad hominem arguments to undermine her credibility and to say, well, who cares? And Wolf thinks there's something really telling about this, right? That someone who worked so hard and went through such a difficult experience with that Supreme Court case, everything that led up to it and the aftermath of it, to be that person and then to have everyone tell you that you're worthless is pretty terrible. And she says, look, just think for a moment about what we're doing here. What you're saying, what we feminists are saying is, shut up, woman. Right? And Wolf says, look, that's an obvious hypocrisy. You can't do that. And so that's where this quote comes from. She says, the first commandment of real feminism is listen to women. And so you have to understand that there are going to be different perspectives. You need to listen to what people are saying. So according to Wolf, there's this party line about abortion. We've seen this already in Callahan. And she notes that it's really, really extreme position. So to tie this into what we've been talking about right up to this point, we've been talking for a while. Moral debates about abortion typically center around questions of wrongfulness of killing, right? So when killing is wrong, what is it that makes it wrong? And that was expressly the point of Marquis and Ryman's chapters. That's what they were arguing about. What is it that makes killing wrong? If we understand that, then we can figure out whether that wrongness is present in abortion or not. So most people seem to think that not all killing is wrong. And so there seems like it's a relatively minority position to think that all killing is wrong. Most people think that, well, there's different perspectives, right? So just to kind of lay out a couple of perspectives. Some people at least think that the state is justified in executing at least certain kinds of people. An awful lot of people think that depending on the circumstances of the war, that soldiers in combat have not done something wrong when they engage in combat and kill enemy combatants. That there's sort of some justification for that. And most people seem to think that there is a justification for killing in self-defense, right? So that if one is in immediate danger or is protecting family or friends or something like that, that killing someone who's trying to kill you is not morally wrong. There's a justification for that. And that's the kind of language, right, that Thompson and other people have used, right? So self-defense becomes this kind of paradigm for justified killing. And Wolf says, look, this default pro-choice feminist position has gone more extreme than that. It doesn't even say that abortion is a justified killing. It talks like abortion isn't killing at all. And you still get these things, right, in debates. You still get people saying, well, it's not even really a human being, right? So why are you so upset about this? And she thinks, well, yeah, of course it's a human being. And most of our authors have been pretty clear about that. Well, yeah, of course a fetus is a human being. The question is, what's the moral status of that human being? Wolf thinks this default pro-choice feminist position has gone so extreme as to be self-deceptive, right? So she talks about the lying and the hardness of heart, that you have to kind of not even look at the facts. You have to distort the facts. You have to kind of lie to yourself in order to make this position work. And she thinks there's something that is incredibly dangerous about this from a moral perspective, right? That the idea of having to lie to yourself about what you're doing or about what the facts of a situation are shows that your moral position is actually indefensible. And that you become the sort of person who lies to yourself, right? So she says we're in danger of losing our souls. It's not good to be the sort of person who lies to yourself, she thinks. It's not good to be the sort of the person who has to hide your head in the sand whenever there are basic biological facts presented to you. And she notes that so part of what's going on here is there's a sort of equal and opposite reaction problem. She notes that in a lot of the pro-life propaganda that women are dehumanized. And she mentions this idea that a pregnant mother is just a vessel. And so suddenly all importance and value is placed solely on the fetus and protecting the life of the unborn, and that the life of the born, the mother, gets kind of left at the wayside. And this is a common kind of criticism of a lot of versions of how pro-life positions play out in actual discussions, debates, legal action, these things. She says, look, there's kind of dehumanization of women that occurs, and so the pro-choice feminists, Wolf thinks, just went to the opposite side and dehumanized the fetus. And so they're essentially doing the same thing, right? They say, oh, you pro-life propaganda, you're terrible, you dehumanize women. And they just went and did the exact same thing. It's just dehumanizing the fetus instead. And Wolf says, look, any feminist position that we're going to take about this needs to be able to affirm the humanity of both the mother and the child. So she's got these moral problems, right? She says there's the hardness of heart and the lying, and then she says there's a sort of political consequence. She thinks that there are a lot of ways that we could improve society according to feminist ideals that we don't actually accomplish because we draw this hard line in the sand on abortion. And so there are people who would agree with an awful lot of other goals that feminists might have for how to make society better for women and for everyone. And those things could actually have a lot of popular support if you didn't make abortion a prerequisite. If you didn't say like complete and all abortion for everyone or get out, that you'd actually have a lot more people on your team. So she really thinks that a lot of things just don't get done because we end up making abortion the hard line. And for a lot of people, abortion is the hard line that they're not willing to cross. And she doesn't think that it has to be so intimately tied to what feminism is. And again, she has her own positive sort of replacement for this rhetoric. She says, well, we need a new rhetoric. Here's the suggestion. People can make hard choices. You can reason out, deliberate, make a decision, really think, okay, this is the best that I can do, right? Given the cards I've been dealt, this is my best option. And you can still wish that things were otherwise. You can still wish that things were better. You can still wish that you had gotten a better hand. And so, in other words, she thinks there's such a thing as a necessary evil, and that when you say necessary evil, you've got to hold both of those parts of that together, right? So you can say that there are things where it really does seem like the only option, even if you don't like it. But that we can say that there's something morally wrong here. And I think it's helpful to go back to to go back to like the case of self-defense, for instance, right? So even if you think you're justified in killing in order to protect yourself or your family, you might still regret having killed someone, right? So someone who kills in self-defense and then says, and I slept like a baby, that we might think that there's something off about that, right? We might think that, well, you shouldn't be so cavalier about that. Like if you did have to kill in self-defense, even if it was justified, even if what you did was morally justified, we might still expect you to kind of feel bad about it, to regret it. And so if we take that same thing, right, even if you think that abortion is morally justified, and then a person makes the decision and undergoes the medical process of abortion, they might still have some regrets. And I don't mean, this is really important actually, we don't mean here the sort of thing that comes up a lot in pro-life arguments, that, well, an awful lot of women who have abortions later regret it, which is a weird kind of thing to say, because an awful lot of women who are pregnant and have babies regret it as well. From time to time, there are moments where you regret that, and that doesn't mean that you would make a different decision, and it doesn't mean that you think that having children is wrong. It just means sometimes you have feelings about things. That's not what Wolf is saying, right? Wolf's saying that one could wish that sort of this counterfactual, that the world were a different place where things didn't have to be this way, this sort of big picture. So not really regret about one's action, but just kind of wishing that the world could be different. And she thinks if this is right, if abortion is a sort of necessary evil, then what you need is a way for people to be able to have a sense of guilt. And again, this is not guilt like I did something wrong and so my conscience is telling me I did something wrong. It's more kind of wishing again that things could be otherwise, right? So a kind of a sense of guilt and a way to discharge that guilt, right? So there's some kind of psychological thing going on here. And she says that there's a conception of sin and redemption. She thinks, oh, actually, we can borrow this from various religions that have this concept, and it would be really, really helpful, right? There's this idea of, okay, I did this, and I wish that the world were a different sort of place, and so I'll make positive steps to try to make the world a better place. And so she has specific ideas, right, about how to do this. But essentially what we get is a pro-choice position that says, yes, there needs to be legal access to abortion, but when people make choices, there are better and worse choices. And not everyone who has an abortion is just in these dire circumstances where they couldn't possibly do anything else. Some people do elect for abortions for very, very elective reasons, and we need to both affirm that, well, if you're going to have legal access to abortion, then some people are going to make that choice, but it still needs to be there for various reasons, because society isn't set up in these good sorts of ways. And so the real focus of our action and our energy then needs to be, here's how we do change those social structures to make the world a little bit of a better place. And if you have this conception of sin and redemption, then you get this impetus for making these choices that would just put a little good back in the world, is kind of the idea. And when we think about these choices, and this is really important, we're not thinking about these as private individual choices, right? But that the world is set up in a way that very often is against women. And it's that sort of setup, that bad hand that's dealt, that leads to a lot of abortions that happen. And so if we want to change that, then the focus needs to be on changing those social structures, giving those better opportunities to women so that people who are pregnant can make different kinds of decisions, right? They have better options. And that's Wolf's sort of main point, and that's Callahan's point too. They're both looking at this big picture. We really need to change the overall setup. We really need to change the overall conception from within feminism And so really a lot of the argument, as I said, is similar, and they just come out differently on whether ultimately abortion would be legal or not, whether it would be morally justified or not. But even in Wolf's case, right, she thinks that if we really could make these changes in society, that abortions would be rare. And that's where you get this sort of ending with the candlelight vigil outside the abortion clinic. So I hope that's helpful. There are obviously details in these arguments that we can take a look at, but I wanted to say something about the overall structure. A lot of the times when we're reading these texts and we get claims and we say, I don't understand why you're saying that, that sounds crazy. I don't know if you ran across that in these chapters, but when you do run across that kind of thing, it really helps to put it in the context and understand, okay, well, it kind of makes a little sense if you look at what this person's doing in the big picture.